Welcome to the Flightline ATC lesson on building an IFR clearance. Now, clearances can get quite complicated, so it's best to break them down into what you can think of as building blocks. The 5 parts of a clearance are represented by the CRAFT acronym, and your job as a delivery controller will be to put these 5 pieces together. We'll go over each of these building blocks one by one, and this lesson doesn't need to be completed all at once, so make sure not to overwhelm yourself. The first building block of CRAFT is quite straightforward. C stands for clearance limit, which is just a fancy way of saying where, or in our case, what airport, the aircraft is cleared to. You can find the destination airport on the top of the middle column of the strip. In this case, Wellensall is the origin airport, and Tofon is the destination. In terms of phraseology, we'll start our clearances with the phrase cleared to the whatever the airport name is, followed by the word airport. The second building block of CRAFT, R, stands for route. This part of the clearance tells pilots how they will get to their clearance limit or destination, particularly focusing on the initial routing. For this example, we'll use a flight plan with a SID, but at the end we'll also cover what to say when pilots don't file a SID. For the phraseology, we'll build off the clearance limit and say via the blank departure, blank transition, then as filed. Let's break that down and look at what you have to check for in the flight plan. The first part, via the blank departure, clears the pilot to fly the SID they've filed. Make sure that the SID can actually be used with the active departure runway before clearing the pilot. The second part, the transition, clears the pilot on the SID via their filed transition waypoint. This is important and a common mistake in flight plans. Pilots filing a SID must have a transition waypoint. If they don't, they must edit their route or opt to not fly the SID. Assuming the transition waypoint is filed correctly, it will be the waypoint in the route directly following the SID. The third part, then as filed, clears the pilot through to their destination via the rest of their route they have filed. I mentioned that it's important, so let's look at what flight plans that have not filed the transition waypoints might look like. In the first example, with Hawaiian 4 Heavy, the pilot has filed the Xerxes 2 departure, but you'll see that they haven't filed anything else in their route. This means they are missing a transition waypoint and will need to be asked to edit their route to include one. In the second example, Thai 5-2 Heavy has also filed the Xerxes 2 departure, then the waypoint Tupe. If we look at the chart for the Xerxes 2 departure, however, Tupe is not one of the valid transition waypoints, and therefore this route is also invalid. It may take some time to look out for these mistakes at first, so don't be afraid to ask pilots to stand by. You'll get the hang of it over time. The third building block of CRAFT is A for altitude. This part of the clearance includes both an initial climb for the pilot as well as clearance for their requested cruise altitude. Before we see what that looks like, however, you'll need to know the general rules for these cruise altitudes. You may remember from a previous lesson, but VFR aircraft have a maximum cruise of 10,000 feet. Additionally, their cruise must be a multiple of 500. IFR aircraft can go all the way up to flight level 250, or 25,000 feet, and their cruise must be a multiple of 1,000. In other words, their requested flight level must end in a 0. For all aircraft, the minimum cruise altitude is 2,000 feet. If a pilot's requested cruise altitude doesn't meet these regulations, they should be told what the nearest legal cruise altitudes are and be asked to refile with one of those. Now for the phraseology. Depending on the airport, the initial climb instructions will differ, so check the SOPs under Initial Altitude Assignments. Whatever the SOP tells you to say is followed by saying, expect, whatever the pilot's filed cruise is, 5 minutes after departure. Remember that only at or above 10,000 feet, altitudes should be said in flight levels, and that the requested cruise on the strip is always in flight levels. Also, while you don't need to know this, the phrase expect cruise 5 minutes after departure is only in case of a loss of communication. It doesn't necessarily mean that the pilot will be cleared to their cruise 5 minutes after departure by the departure or center controllers. Both the route and altitude parts of the clearance are definitely the most work, and it gets easier from here. The fourth building block, F, is for frequency. This refers to the departure frequency, meaning the frequency that the pilot will contact after takeoff. Normally, this should be the approach and departure frequency for your respective airport, but if they are not online, then remember the top-down procedures. Center would be top-down for departure and would become the departure frequency. Top-down only works one way though, so tower can never be top-down for departure, and tower can never be the departure frequency. In the case that both departure and center are offline, then you would say departure offline Unicom on 122.8. Otherwise, you'd say the words departure frequency followed by giving the frequency one digit at a time. The decimal can either be pronounced point or decimal. Also, make sure to not use the words contact or monitor in your clearance, as this would indicate to the pilot to go to the departure frequency after reading back, and we don't want that. The last building block of the clearance is the transponder. The transponder is the instrument that pilots put the squawk code into, at least in real life, so in this context, the T for transponder refers to assigning the squawk code. If you recall, the squawk code is the top number of the second column of the strip. Simply end your clearance by saying the word squawk, followed by the 4-digit number on the strip. Then you've done it. In just 5 simple steps, you've completed a clearance. The full clearance would be read as follows. Turkish Tree 948, cleared to the Tofan Bridge Airport via the Kaiser Tree departure, Wessel transition, then as filed. Maintain 3000, expect flight level 100 5 minutes after departure, departure frequency 130.5, squawk 1614. Now, I mentioned much earlier that there are cases where pilots file IFR but don't file a SID. In that case, we call these radar vector departures, and the route and initial altitude assignment section of the clearance will be slightly different. Note that pilots may still file waypoints in their route, but if there's no SID, then it's still a radar vector departure. So, when we have a radar vector departure, we can no longer clear them via a SID, then as filed, since there is no SID. Instead, they will be vectored by departure control to their first waypoint, or if they've filed no waypoints, then all the way to their destination. The phraseology for this part would either be via radar vectors, whatever the first waypoint is, then as filed, or if they have no waypoints, via radar vectors, destination airport name, direct. If they haven't filed any route, they aren't told then as filed because they will be vectored the entire way to their destination. As for the change in the initial altitude assignment, this depends on the SOP. Again, look in the initial altitude assignment section and you'll be told what to assign there. In Tofan's case, quote, assign all aircraft on a radar vector departure, maintain 3000. After you've given the clearance though, what's left for you? Well, pilots are required to read back their clearance in full, and if they don't, tell them full readback required. Keep in mind that they don't have to read back the clearance word for word or in order, they just have to read back all the elements of craft. In the case that a readback has an incorrect element, follow up with the pilot saying negative and then what they should have read back. And if the readback was missing something, then follow up with confirm and then whatever was missing. When this happens, pilots only need to read back what was incorrect or missing, not the entire clearance. Once all that is done and the readback is correct, then let the pilot know readback correct, and then hand them off to ground or whichever controller is responsible for ground under top-down procedures. Lastly, back to a bit of strip marking, remember that the top left and middle left boxes of the right of the strip are for annotations. If the pilot reports they have the ATIS, type the appropriate ATIS letter into the top left box, and once they read back the clearance correctly, click to add a check mark on the middle left box. That's all from me, and that's all for IFR clearances. It can definitely be a lot to process at first, so take your time and make sure to ask any questions if you have them. With that, we'll see you on the scopes.